Hey everyone, you're here with Mark Bawa on Perfect Gardens TV. So today we have a special guest, actually one of the leading top agronomists in Canada, actually, and he's been literally leading the charge and the vision of living soil in Canada. And so today we're actually here with a couple of the other new content creators, Dave, Mike, and Aaron from, you've obviously seen them on some of the other videos.
If you haven't checked out our monthly membership, I highly recommend to do so. Just for $2.99, your questions get sent to the top for quick replies. I'm asking for a little more support to build up my war chest so that I can continue to keep giving you open and honest reviews, and we can further defend our right for free speech. Thank you so much, everyone.
And we're going to go ahead and turn it on to our special guest, so you can go ahead and introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about you. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen with Dave.
Great. Thanks, Mark. So, my name's Av Singh, and when it comes to more in the cannabis space, working with many growers and kind of focusing a little bit around living soil, designing a lot of living soils for different licensed producers, that's been kind of my interest. I think living soil is definitely gaining a lot of popularity within the cannabis space, and there's a lot more work demand for me to either design specific soils or talk about how it can fit into this regulated space that we have in Canada. I think it's really important to, before I talk a lot about other things, is just to recognize that I'm coming into this world in Canada really not being a part of the subculture. In the 80s, I had I dialed a pager number to, that was my contribution to the subculture, to get delivery from my dealer. But, it was organic farmers, and a lot of my work has been done in organic agriculture. It was organic farmers teaching me a little bit about, what's going on with the plant, if they had aphids or nutrient deficiencies. So I learned a lot from organic farmers. And then my passion is working with plants and soil. And so it was just kind of a natural progression coming into the cannabis space. If I was to speak a little bit of what I do, I am an independent cannabis consultant. Fleming and Singh Cannabis, we've been around for about 4 years in Canada, but working with various companies, trying to get a more regenerative organic approach to cannabis production, working in 6 different continents. We've got clients in about 20 different countries. Predominantly in Canada and the US. Not all of them are using living soil, but we try to push that a lot. Do a lot of volunteer work with groups like Regeneration Canada, Canadian Organic Growers, and Nevdanya. Currently teaching a cannabis cultivation course at the Nova Scotia Community College. Our goal there is to really drive home what it is to be a cultivation technician or a sanitation technician in the regulated cannabis space. And now there's a little bit of interest, of course, in the psychedelics and in medicinal and psychedelic mushrooms. So helping out some organizations in that respect, trying to push whole tinctures and an organic approach to that. So
before we get over to the first question, it's kind of interesting how much, people want to bring the best quality to this plant, and ends up actually starting to turn over to other industries where it's creating a higher demand and higher expectation on the quality of the output of even the food. And like you said, other mushrooms and other things that can be grown. And so I find that to be very interesting, how this plant is the gateway to many things, even to, lifting our higher consciousness to, once again, higher quality, healthier food for us. Are you ready for the first question?
Yeah, but I just wanted to reiterate what you just said. I think that is so important to recognize how cannabis definitely been that gateway drug to get society to better understand that, in fact, go back and learn from the fact that we have a lot of these natural medicines. And hopefully, as the cannabis sector evolves and matures, we're going to move away from just focusing around THC and CBD and start learning, of course, more about the terpenoids and the flavonoids and the sterols and other ligands in that plant. And hopefully we can take that into the psychedelic realm to the point where we're not only focusing on psilocybins, psilocins, and, some particular chemicals, and thinking about the whole plant or the whole natural medicine.
You know, when I went and visited the Navajo Nation, I picked up some spearmint smoke and some purple tip sheep yodi, which is, you know, different things like good blessing ways or, you know, mind and spirit, body and spirit. And it's just really interesting what you're talking about, how there's just so many herbal medicines out there that we're not discussing, we haven't explored. And like we said, this is just the gateway to exploring all these other plants and what really can come of them. So I love that. That's really cool. Mike, what do you think? Can we bring you on? Because Mike is the reason why we have this gentleman on the channel right now. So I just want to say thank you so much again for Mike for just spearheading this.
Hi, guys. I'd like to say hi to everybody, Aaron and Dave, Mark, and it's good to see you. We've never met personally. We've spoken a couple of times on the phone, and we've met because I had a problem. And I reached out, Dave, and he responded to me right away, and we started a relationship, and now we're here. So my question is, you know, my situation, I'm an outdoor grower. I grow for extraction purposes only. I don't sell any flower. I don't have any interest in the flower itself. I'm only I grow THC. I grow trichomes. So I like to grow outside. I either do a combination of greenhouses and open fields. So I was thinking of taking care of my fields this year, and the plots that I used, test plots that I used last season, I was going to add biochar this fall or in the spring. That is my question. And what would be the benefits? Do I really need it? Is it a good thing? Or
great. Yeah, good question. I'm sure your viewers are familiar with biochar, but you know, biochar is one of those things that not all biochar is created equally. And it really comes down to some of your philosophical reasons of why you might want to be using biochar. Biochar can be a very sustainable product. It can sequester a lot of carbon, but it can also be produced in unsustainable manners. And then it's really no better than maybe some of our exploitation of peat fields and or the transportation of cocoa coir. So in my opinion, it's always great to do a bit of research on your biochar, making sure you've got a more sustainable source of biochar being used. Biochar is essentially, it comes from recognizing what indigenous groups have done for millennia, especially in South America, where they showed that incomplete pyrolysis, so you know, essentially not a complete combustion of woody products, created a charcoal-like substance, and that charcoal-like substance has a lot of positive and negative charges and has that ability to hold on to a lot of positively and negatively charged ions, cations or anions. And a lot of our nutrients, whether it's ammonia or sulfates or phosphates, calcium, they are either positively charged or negatively charged. So biochar has that ability to hold on to a lot of those nutrients. One of the important things that Mike brought up in his question is that he's looking to use biochar in an outdoor environment. One of the real benefits of using biochar in an outdoor environment, it really depends on your soil type. So if you've got a very sandy soils typically will have less organic matter. So they don't have that ability. Organic matter in itself has a lot of positive and negative charges and can really hold on to nutrients. If you don't have a lot of organic matter, like you have an incredibly well-draining soil, like a sandy soil, using biochar is a good opportunity to kind of grab onto a lot of those nutrients, because if not, they will be leached into the runoff as water infiltrates through the sandy soil. If you've got a very clay soil, one of the challenges with clay is a lot of people complain about clay, but the one great thing about clay is that if you dump a bunch of nutrients on, it's going to hold on to those nutrients. The challenge with clay is that sometimes it doesn't give up those nutrients as freely to the plant as the roots might want those nutrients, but they're held so tightly in the clay that they can't grab it. What biochar does is kind of very similar to what we say when we talk about calcium, is we flocculate our soils. So it kind of pushes clay particles apart a bit. And biochar can have that ability to do that as well. So that way it works out quite well in a clay soil as well. The most important thing I think that comes across is once you know your soil type, then adding biochar is an opportunity for your soils to hold on to a lot of nutrients, and then over time be able to give those nutrients to the plant. what I often do is make sure that the biochar is definitely been tested for heavy metals. You don't want to introduce heavy metals that, any input that's going to have heavy metals like cadmium, mercury, lead, or arsenic, and have that picked up by the plant. And then I would typically charge my biochar. So by charging, I mean perhaps using a compost tea or a fermented tea and or fish hydrolysate, humic acids, anything that you want to do to kind of load or pre-charge your biochar before you incorporate it into your soil. And I would typically put it in the fall or spring. I wouldn't have a worry about putting it in the fall, especially if it's charged. It is a good way of providing a home for microbes, potential food source for microbes. We have to remember here in Canada, at least, and where you are, Michael, you can have almost six months where you don't actually have a lot of food source for those microbes. By providing that biochar, kind of incorporating it into the top 4 to 6 inches is an ideal way of kind of keeping those microbes happy. But definitely check for heavy metals, check for the sustainability of how that biochar is being created, and then I would encourage you to charge it prior to incorporating it. What do you think of that, Mike?
It makes total sense to me. So basically what I would do is, I don't know if you've seen any of the other videos, but when I make my living soil for my organic interior grow, I went and got 3 or 4 inches off the old forest growth soil. So it had plenty of material in it, plenty of living stuff. And then I brought it in, I mixed in some Pro Mix and some horse manure and some bone marrow. And then I put in some live worms and I left it for about 30 days. And then I started using it in my garden and it's working great for me. So I was thinking what I was going to do, since I'm breaking new ground and I am in old forest soil. So I got a really dark, black, very rich soil. Like the drainage is okay on it too. So I'm thinking of using it in the test beds that I grew the last summer, but I'm going to do it in the spring if I can find a reliable source. That, it has full of benefits, but if you can't find a reliable source, then you're chasing your tail.
Yeah, and the most thing, and this may not apply to all the viewers in different parts, but what we try to do is always try to keep your soil covered as long as you possibly can. There's nothing better than providing, photosynthesis and having that miracle of photosynthesis, producing those sugars and feeding the roots as long as possible. If you can wait, if you aren't able to get a cover crop in at this time of year, then I would try to wait and work up the soil in the fall. Or in the spring, and then you can use ways of kind of using compost teas and fermented teas as early as possible, and you can get that bed prepared as early as hopefully like June, when you might be transplanting at that time.
Aaron, will you go ahead and ask your question? What were you thinking?
Yeah, just on the lines that he brought up the clay, it got me thinking about the clay balls. I use clay balls in my I'm sorry, Abe. It's Aaron. Nice to meet you.
Hey, nice to meet you, Aaron.
Yeah, thanks for being on here with us. So I use clay balls in my media and mix into my soil because I wanted to give my the beneficial bacteria and fungi, something to latch onto in the cocoa when I was making my own soils, right? So then I heard, someone said that the clay balls, they only can house the bad bacteria, the stuff that you don't want, which didn't really make sense to me. I didn't think, the bacteria and fungi really knew the difference between, what clay balls it was attaching itself to. But what's your theory behind that?
I think the person who may have told you that may have been referring to like in a hydroponic system in which you may not have total aerobic conditions, right? So if you've got using those expanded clay pellets or the hydroton balls, and they're kind of sitting in stagnant water or sitting in water excessively, and there's not enough oxygen in that can create an environment in which you would have typically what we would consider more of the pathogenic types of bacteria and fungi. We also have to remember that a lot of the beneficial microbes that we talk about, they can do quite well with limited amounts of oxygen, right? So when we say anaerobic, we're talking about those microbes that can handle a facultative anaerobe is something that can grow with a little bit of oxygen, but can also work in environments with little oxygen. And those are sometimes our most beneficial microbes. Microbes aren't going to choose between, what clay is not going to be able to discern, what is considered a beneficial microbe and what's a pathogenic microbe. And in many ways, those are terms that we put on to those microbes. They may be considered a pathogen to us, but in fact, they're just part of that soil ecosystem. They have a valuable role in that soil ecosystem in terms of nutrient cycling. So those are just arbitrary terms. But I think once again, I think you're bang on with those expanded clay pellets. Very similar to biochar. Before using them, of course, you rinse them as best you can so that you don't clog up your drip lines or your table. But one of the things that we really like to do is charge it with a compost tea, or if you've got a preferential microbial inoculant that you like to do, I always charge that up and then use that as very similar to what I do with lava pumice or lava, anything like that. Kind of give it.
Okay, great. No, that's great. That answers my question, and it kind of goes into my next question, because I was going to ask you about like what is your best consortium of like bacteria and like fungi for cannabis, like beneficial bacteria and funguses. What would you recommend are the the best ones to use for cannabis in particular?
And just to add on to that real fast, is there a pecking order, or like a beneficial bacteria and fungus that you recommend to start with, and a beneficial bacteria you might if they're midway through or end, you might recommend to encourage more of than another?
Yeah. So it's without necessarily naming names of brand products, it does come down to really what you want to be getting out of the microbes as well, right? So if initially you're focused around your biggest concerns, your biggest worries, the last time your last grow, if you ended up having some root rots or whatever, then you feel like, okay, so I need something that are more root protectants. Maybe there's something in my drip lines or in my soil that is causing some increased disease. I want to create a more disease suppressive soil, or a living soil bed or anything like that. So then I'm thinking I want to have a lot more root protectant type microbes. That's where you might turn to, of course, using mycorrhizal inoculants. We often associate mycorrhizae as something that can help cycle phosphorus really well. But it is actually a great root protectant. So if you can inoculate your either your clone or your seed as early as possible, you'll get some of that benefit of that mycorrhizae. And mycorrhizae can take pathogenic bacteria and turn them into less of a pathogen. They can actually kill them. Trichoderma, you may have come across a trichoderma species. There are many that work as root protectants and work right alongside mycorrhizae to be able to fight off root pathogens. And one that I particularly look towards is Bacillus amylocofascians. So it's look for one of the longest names on one of those packages. But Bacillus amylocofascians is another one of those kind of root protectant bacteria. So if that was my biggest concern, I'm going to get that right in, and I'm going to try to get it in very early. Cannabis is a relatively short cycle crop, and so if you really want to, if you're like, for example, growing in containers versus a living soil bed, you want to make sure that you get that infection of the mycorrhizae as early as possible, and so doing a root dip. Right from the clone plug, or right as you're taking your seedling and transplanting it into a 1 gallon or a solo cup or into a bed, get that mycorrhizae to that plant to really initiate that infection as early as possible. When I look at other species, for me, when I think of a large consortium, I turn to worm castings or a really good compost. That's kind of my main way of saying, here's the kitchen pantry. Let the plant decide what it needs when it needs it, and it'll send out the signals to say, hey, I need some Pseudomonas because I need some phosphorus cycling. I need some more roots. I'm gonna send out some foods for Bacillus subtilis. So I let kind of the compost or worm castings really deal with the larger scale of letting the plant choose. But when I specifically need something, and say when I design most super soils, I will push a Pseudomonas species, a Bacillus species, usually a Bacillus subtilis species, and then some type of root protectant. What I'm looking for when I'm making a just add water super soil is I need that nutrient cycling to happen as quick as possible. And so that's when I'm looking for that inoculation. I don't use compost teas like overly frequently. I might use one in veg. I might actually use a fermented tea sort of in sort of that second, third week of flower. And then I might go back to a compost tea in the sort of the 6th week of like a 8-9 week flowering strain. And that so the fermented tea is just, I'm trying to push as much
CO2.
What, sorry?
CO2 into the soil for?
No, kind of never. You really don't want to put too much CO2 in the soil, because that can impact it. That can really slow down microbial life, right? If you get too much CO2 into your soil, you will slow down microbial life. Oxygen, typically, but the fermented part is mainly because of the lactobacillus. I know I'm going to get a lot of lactobacillus species in a good ferment. And I'm trying to push that CBGA, right? And I know that there's some precursors to forming CBGA. So CBGA, for any of those who don't like to geek out about cannabinoid biosynthesis, that's the grandparent molecule that'll either be turned into CBDA or THCA. And it kind of peaks at around the 4-week mark of a cannabis plant's, if it's like an 8-week, 9-week flower strain. So I want to get that fermented stuff into the soil. Hopefully it'll trigger the production of these secondary metabolites like CBGA, or whether it's olivetic acid or hexanoic acid, all these precursors that will turn into CBGA. If we can produce as much of that as we can, then I've gained as much as I possibly can in terms of what my THC potential will be. And then I think what Aaron was referring to as well is that I do like, hey, if we all love terps. I know that I'm really going to push terpenes and flavonoids in those last 2 to 3 weeks, right? So if I can get a tea that is going to encourage increased bacteria, and using bacteria as a way of increasing my terpene content, then I'm going to sort of hit in that sort of 6th, 7th, 8th week. Because at the same time, I'm recognizing that's when the plant is really shutting down its communication with the roots. It's a kind of the time that a lot of the auxin, and auxin being that phytohormone, AUXIN, auxin, that phytohormone really drives where the sugars go in the plant. And if we can and sort of later in the plant's life stage, it moves all of that auxin away from the roots. So now the roots aren't getting any of the benefit of photosynthesis. If I go and throw in a nice compost tea in there at that time, I feel like I'm kind of feeding the roots a little bit more, knowing that the plant has kind of not given up on those roots, but is saying, hey, I've got to focus on my flower and fruit production. So that would, I don't know, Aaron, if that answered your question, but I typically will use a more of a broad consortium with my compost and my compost and worm castings. I will pick individual microbes that I know can do whatever I need to do, whether it's root protectant or nutrient cycling or terpene synthesis. And other than that, I may use a compost tea, compost extract, or a fermented tea.
I know a bunch
Okay,
of you
no,
guys that
that's-
want to jump in on this one. So which one first?
No, that's great. That's great. I really appreciate that. That did answer a lot of the question that I had, and it brought me into another idea about what's your opinion on the beneficial bacteria from like aquaponics and fish tanks mixed into the soil, because you're bringing a different, environment, and like the water, like the pea urine water from the fish tanks, how that works into the soil biology of the plant soil that we mix into our soil.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Real quick, to ask real fast. So you switch from aerobic to an anaerobic to an aerobic tea. And you're the third person in 12 years I've heard do this. And it's really interesting. And we're going to go back to Aaron's. Please do not forget that question. You're the third person that has talked about this in years. And but just explain to me my ignorance. Help me up with my ignorance on this one. So when you're fermentating, you're producing CO2, right? And I'm not trying to harp on that, but you're going after the bacteria. And so that bacteria, once it gets in there, it off gases real quick, I'm guessing, and it's not concerned. And then it adjusts the pH.
Really, like when you, Mark, do you may actually make some fermented teas or anything?
Absolutely. I mean, like think about beer, everything. I mean, everything. We're in a fermenting culture. It's like absolutely. And that's why I'm really interested. You're like the third person in 12 years talking about fermentation teas, and it's how you're using them too. And the transition or the fourth week too is really interesting.
In my fermented tea is incredibly basic. If we weren't talking cannabis, for the most part, it's going to be comfrey, stinging nettle, perhaps horsetail. I have all of those growing near my garden. But usually that second or third week of flower fermented tea comes from any of the clippings of, when I'm pruning and cleaning up my cannabis plants. I just take all of that material, throw it into a 5-gallon bucket, chop it up, cover it with water. I don't add any sugar or anything like that. I know others would do that, but I just kind of leave it at that. Here in my, it takes about 10 days to kind of get to that gelatinous foam.
Mm-hmm.
There is definitely some carbonation in the sense you can see some good foaming and bubbling action happening. But when you actually stir it around and ready to pour it, there's no carbonation there. So most of the CO2 has definitely gassed off. I don't have it in a sealed container. It's
what does that bacteria do though specifically you have found? Does it in like bring out exacerbate the precursors or what have you found?
I think there's a couple of things. If you kind of grab it at its sort of its gelatinous form, right? So when you're kind of brewing these teas, right? And when I say brewing, it's essentially just waiting for it to become foul smelling. You can kind of give it a good stir, and there's a time when it's still a lot of plant material. Then it gets into a more like gel, almost like aloe vera sap, right? It's kind of that kind of feel to it. That's when I use it. If I wait too long, and because I'm actually a terrible grower in the sense that I love my plants, but I don't give them enough love. I don't focus on them when I should. So sometimes my teas might go beyond that gelatinous stage and they become more liquidy. When they become more liquidy, I'm almost just giving it a straight nutrient. It is very much like a nutrient tea. I've probably gone beyond the phase of actually getting some of the benefits of things like the lactobacillus species that would be in there. You probably have a lot of yeast in there, maybe some streptomyces. When we look at something that's like effective microorganisms like EM, you'll also have some non-sulfur purple bacteria. I have never analyzed my fermented teas to know if I actually have that. I'm pretty confident I have lactobacilli species because they're.
Do you use molasses, Ave?
I don't. I do. Not in my fermented teas. I would if I was making a fermented extract. I'd use probably brown sugar or something like that. I don't use it in my compost tea in my veg period, but I might use it in my my late flower compost tea or extract. And we're jumping around, but one of the main reasons, I know a lot of people who use molasses every time they use a tea or even every time they feed. Adding too much molasses can make it very difficult for a plant to decide really what it wants to have as a meal, because molasses is a particular sugar that is going to drive a very similar profile of bacteria or microbes. They're the microbes that just love that type of sugar, and so if you applied it every week, there's a part in the plant's life cycle that says, shit, I don't want these bacteria. I've spent a lot of energy getting rid of these bacteria, and then it seems like every week they keep coming back. So I try not to use molasses all the time, because it will highly select for those that love that type of sugar. I'm not sure if I really finished Mark's comment there.
Yeah, no, go ahead. I'm sorry. That happens a lot. We get organic questions, and it just kind of organically jumps around.
Yeah.
You mentioned the tea so many times. I just wanted to throw it out there while you were on the subject. I didn't mean to take you away from Mark's question. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, not at all. And that's the beauty of organic in my sense, is that everything is interconnected, right? There's no way of getting around it. So Mark, do you have any other more questions around that? Or because I could go and answer the living water question that Aaron posed as well, because I think that's phenomenal. And I don't know how many of you have been able to try aquaponic food, but to me, aquaponic food actually is some of the best tasting food. If it's an aquaponic tomato or lettuce, phenomenal flavor to it. And it's really hard to imagine that, because if you followed any of Elaine Ingham's work, she did an amazing job of getting much of the agricultural society to waken up and to understand about soil biology. But the biology in water, and in a system like an aquaponic system, is actually probably not exponentially greater than that in soil biology, but it is larger. So you actually have more life in a ecosystem of an aquaponic ecosystem than you do in a soil system. And so most of the aquaponic growers that we work with, we recommend a dual root zone system. So we have a just add water, living soil on the top, and then we use a partition to separate that living soil and then feed it living water from the aquaponic system. So they get the roots actually get the best of both worlds. Early on, they have just living soil, then they get a living water. And, arguably, I'm sure it's some of the best tasting can as well.
I completely agree. Man, I want to go back to that fermentation thing again. I'm sorry.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I'm so sorry. It's just, and I'm just trying to dig in why again. Is your thought process, because when you make that gelatinous experience, is it because you're creating a kind of like an insulation experience around the root system, so there's extra food for the aerobic bacteria that's living on the roots? Is that why you're doing that?
No, sorry. Totally didn't answer that question properly. But that whole gelatinous aspect is that, to me, in my opinion, that's when you actually have the most amount of
bacteria,
facultative aerobes and facultative anaerobes. If I don't take it at that time, I may only get anaerobic bacteria and microbes, right? Because it's going to get to the point where any of those facultative ones have been outcompeted by the ones that only live with absolutely no oxygen. And
you're doing that specifically for diversity of bacteria?
And specifically because I know lactobacillus is one that's going to be prominent at that kind of stage. And lactobacillus is one of those that seems to either have derivatives that can produce things like olivitic acid, hexanoic acid, that geranyl pyrophosphate that becomes those either it turns into terpenes or turns into cannabinoids, and so that's where we want more of those type of microbes.
Completely interesting.
Yeah.
Wow, that's very interesting.
And it is interesting.
Very interesting.
But I always think that that's why we all, especially if you're making compost tea, right? It's all about being aerobic and aerobic. But a lot of the players that actually do the grunt work are facultative aerobes or facultative anaerobes. It's that kind of in the margins, they're doing a lot of that work. So when we talk about Bacillus subtilis, it's a power, and there's many different strains of Bacillus subtilis, but Bacillus pumilus, Bacillus thuringiensis, these are all Bacillus species. Many of them are those facultative anaerobes that they can kind of live with or without oxygen. So that's why I go from, even in a compost tea, that's what we want. Fermented tea, hopefully we get some of that as well. And then whatever in compost extracts and things.
Dave?
Yeah.
So when you're making those fermentations, that specific bacteria, it's like right in the middle between the main bacteria anaerobic. They're right in the middle because in the fermentation process, they were derived with, in my mind, would be less oxygen during that fermentation process. So they would be more prone in the soil to live in potentially overwatered situations or underwatered situations.
You're bang on. Okay. But we would more in the, we like to use the term saturated.
Right.
So it's a fine line. And so what we're trying to go with is, you probably have seen kind of that definition of what is soil, and 45% of soil is probably your mineral component. You get some organic matter, and then you have 50% that's kind of air and water. That 50% that's air and water, sometimes it's going to be 20% air and it's going to be 30% water. And other times it's going to be 30% air and 20% water. So what we're trying to do, and it's so important to recognize that the soil is so incredibly dynamic that within seconds you can have species that are turning off and species that are turning on. And once again, thanks to all the work that Elaine Ingham did to highlight this, we now know that there's thousands and thousands of different species that are so particular to a particular amount of temperature or the particular amount of dissolved oxygen. And as soon as that turns on or off, if it changes too much, or a particular exudate is delivered by a plant, and exudate meaning things like amino acids or vitamins or sugars, which plants can dictate, that'll turn off 10 different species, and the plant can change the pH of the root, and all of a sudden you lose 10 different species and you gain 20. So it's happening in real time. It's incredibly fast that these changes happen. So
can I further what you're saying and asking a question that if the plant is communicating, let's say it needs certain minerals, and the bacteria are out breaking down and mineralizing, making it available for the plant, and let's say we consistently oversaturated to where we actually had a dieback. Could you then, in the result of the oversaturation, could you then potentially see a toxicity form in the plant, because potentially that's going to be more readily, or they're in the process of breaking it down for their cellular growth. They're getting the sugars from the plant, the carbohydrates, but then they potentially die back, not by choice from the plant, but by our own doing. Could you then create a toxicity in your plant from that?
I mean, by toxicity, like we can, if we don't have the right nutrients and or the right microbes to turn those nutrients and make them available to the plant, we can run into a disorder. For example, like a a phosphorus deficiency. When you see a phosphorus deficiency happening, you will see high levels of magnesium formulating, and just, when you see plants with a phosphorus deficiency, you can see that they got that darker green, almost blue like green color to them. That's because magnesium is just building there. It's building and building, and you're getting a toxicity of magnesium because there's a phosphorus deficiency. Why do we have a phosphorus deficiency? Well, maybe the root system is too cold, and because of that, we don't have the Pseudomonas species that can cycle that phosphorus and make it available. Maybe we are actually having some root dieback. Maybe there's a bit of a nutrient lockout around phosphorus and whatnot. The one thing to remember, unless we really screw things up by somehow, incredibly overwatering a plant, or adding the nutrients that really create a toxicity of a nutrient lockout or something like that. When you have 5,000 or 10,000 different species of microbes in an incredibly healthy soil, there is so much redundancy. And that's what, we often fail to remember, that nature does not only make one Bacillus subtilis strain to cycle nitrogen. There are hundreds and hundreds of different species that can cycle nitrogen. So if the temperature changes and Bacillus subtilis can't do a good job of it, there's something else that's an Azobacter or a Nitrosomus or something like that will come in there and do the job as well. In every different type of condition, we'll have something that can kind of fill up that space in a healthy ecosystem, right? We as Dave, as you mentioned, we are usually the reasons why systems fall apart. We often have that mentality of hey, if a little bit is good, more is definitely better. And that idea of adding a compost tea maybe every week, yeah, maybe that's a little too much, and maybe that's not actually helping the plant.
All right, man. I'm just gonna ask. I don't know if I want to go up or if I want to stay in the area we're at. Okay, as
long as we don't go down.
Yeah, well, okay, we're okay. What? I'll go to minerals, then we'll go up real quick. Or no, let's just stay on the bacteria and then we'll go to minerals. What bacteria and fungi are best for IPM and on foliar sprays?
Sorry, for
integrated pest management. Yeah, like PM and botrytis, and just kind of like coating your plant with living bacteria so nothing else can take host, and then also making sure that they don't fail bacteria testing at the end of their grow. Because I think those two are very playing combination right now, where they want to work with bacteria, they want to fight off the PM and the other stuff, because that's one way of failing. But are the testing that they are testing for, are they also testing for the microbial life that we're putting on there to help fight them?
Right, and of course that will vary state by state, and of course here in Canada, we with the regulated industry, there's only certain foliar biopesticides that you're allowed to use anyway, and because of that, right? So for example, we can't use Serenade. Serenade is a Bacillus pumilis, because if we did, I think that would end up failing one of our microbials. So it's not approved for cannabis in Canada. Where I believe in California, you are allowed to use Bacillus pumilis or Serenade. Maybe it's Serenade. I'm not sure. I don't want Bioworks to get upset with me.
No, you're correct. It's Serenade, yeah, and I've actually found that product to be too strong if they don't use it in a tea with other living bacteria and fungi. I found that to be the case a few times.
What do you mean by too strong?
Well, okay. So again, I'm a grower. I'm not a scientist, so I go off visual experience, and I'm like, hey, that shit works. Go with it, right?
Arguably, I do my science the same way.
Okay. So what I have found is that when I have PM and I'm using a living bacteria, because I go back in the back of the bacteria and I actually look at them and I see what they're actually being used for. And I find one for my PM or for my problem. And so what I found is that when I use a more array of the ones that maybe, I don't know if they meant to it, but just because they're in the back of the ball, the same similar ones that are used for soil can also be used for IPM on some of the brands out there. So I look, and all of them are different. Some of them are different, some of them are the same. So when I put it on there, I found that the IPM can actually, like the mold or the powdery mildew can totally go away and the leaves can come back with very minimal damage, right? And then again, the Serenade, why I found using it, just one bacteria spraying it on the plant at the recommended dose at times, it just seems to dry it all out and then just kills it instantly. Okay. So I've experienced being able to recover the plant and bring the leaf almost completely back to life versus using like law of minimum, law of tolerance example, using only of one and too much. It seems to kill it, does the job, but it also seems to really, it won't, it hurts the plant as well because I found that the leaf can actually come back from damage. Right. So what do you think about that?
So, I'm going to step back, and I'm actually going to step back to the topic of minerals before we really, get back to truly answering your question. So for me, the foundation of integrated pest management is nutrition. And I will always equate that the whole root system is a parallel to our own digestive system. And our digestive system is really the foundation of our own immune system. So it's really important to recognize the roots are very similar to our digestive system, and the roots are the foundation of a plant's immune system. So what my whole goal in terms of growing a canna that is more resistant to powdery mildew is to grow the healthiest possible plant. Right. So it seems like, counterintuitive. Of course, if your plant's healthy, it doesn't have PM. Well, it doesn't have PM because you grew it with good health. And so good health, it really comes down to a lot of times having the right environmental conditions, right? So we need to, if you're growing indoors, of course, you need to have your vapor pressure deficit to be appropriate so that you are getting good transpiration. Transpiration is really the only way that we can bring proper nutrition into the plant. And in particular, calcium. So calcium is so critical to making sure that you get a healthy plant, because then, calcium will form calcium pectate, which forms that hard cell wall. And then making sure that you're feeding the right amount of nitrogen. You feed too much nitrogen, and in particular in forms like nitrate nitrogen. The plant loves nitrate nitrogen. All plants love it. It's chocolate. You could definitely get all your whole caloric intake eating chocolate, but is it good for you? It actually takes a plant a lot of energy to use and consume nitrate nitrogen, but the more you give it, the more it'll take. What happens when you take too much nitrate nitrogen? You get thinner cell walls. You actually have more water uptake into the plant cell wall. All of that is a magnet to powdery mildew. And it's really important to recognize that powdery mildew is ubiquitous. That means it's everywhere, right? You won't fail a microbial test because you have powdery mildew. You will produce shitty tasting if you've got powdery mildew, but you won't fail a microbial test because everyone recognizes that powdery mildew is everywhere. But if you've got a healthy plant, with really strong cell walls, if you've got a healthy plant because you've been feeding it a well-balanced nutrition where the plant can dictate what it wants to eat and when it wants to eat it, you know full well that when you grow a plant, and I'm going to pick on hydroponics only because most hydroponics plants I see, they haven't been given all of the other stuff in terms of they haven't been given the microbes. They haven't been able to get a lot of the trace minerals at times. And you grow a plant in living soil, they look very different. And you can see it in the color of the leaf. You can see it in the thickness of the leaf. if you're optimizing your photosynthesis, you're able to produce almost a waxy layer on that leaf surface. All of these things make it really hard for powdery mildew spores to both penetrate into the leaf surface and or survive when they're on the leaf surface. Let alone a healthy plant, if infected by powdery mildew, if it can maintain its health for the duration of the life cycle of the plant, that powdery mildew will choose not to sporulate, right? Because it's a healthy plant. Powdery mildew, plants are often affected by powdery mildew, but you don't see the spores because the plant isn't in stress. If the plant gets overly stressed, the powdery mildew gets stressed and then decides to, hey, my host is going to die. I better produce a whole bunch of offspring and live. So the key to addressing powdery mildew for the first part is making sure you've got an incredibly healthy plant with mineral nutrition and the right environmental conditions. Now, secondly, we have most of our clients who are using living soil do not spray. They don't use foliar. They actually don't use foliar feeds. They don't use any biopesticides. But there are some biopesticides that definitely work. And if you're looking at microbial biopesticides, for the most part, the ones that we would recommend, actinovate is one that I believe is Streptomyces. Mark, you're going to validate these, right? But I think actinovate is one that we use. I think it's a Streptomyces. Then cyclone. Cyclone is a fermented lactic acid, and regalia, which is I believe it's a fermented Japanese knotweed. Those would be the main and there's like variations of that, instead of cyclone, I think lactosan is another one. I hate dropping names because I'm sure I'm going to leave some off. But those are some of the biopesticides that are typically used to address powdery mildew. You can, of course, oftentimes our first step is, nutrition, of course, but if we're going to use something, some people like sulfur. I'm not a big fan of using vaporized sulfur, but others will use oils. So you can use a mineral oil or a canola oil or something like that. You can use that as a bit of a suffocant. Never use sulfur and oil. That's a disaster. And then I guess hydrogen peroxide. We have a product called Xeritol, or you probably use Xeritol or have Xeritol. Xeritol is a product that can be used just to help treat a little bit of early on. In fact, a lot of people use it just even at the time of harvest. Although it's not permitted as a pesticide, I know that people use hypochlorous acid. It seems to have a lot of benefit in terms of really kind of cleaning up that plant and controlling small amounts of powdery mildew. And then lastly, a lot of folks will use potassium bicarbonate millstop as a powdery mildew.
So I know Aaron had his hand up. Aaron, do you want to ask your question? And Mike, do you have any other questions too? Because if not, man, you hit like 3 or 4 things that were just we can get into.
And you notice how I avoided answering your exact question. Your exact question was around microbes, and I don't.
No, you actually. When I said should we go further or should we go up? The further was minerals. My question was, what minerals do you find that bacteria seem to utilize or consume more than other minerals? And then the other question beyond that was, what minerals have you found to be to identify to be the best IPM for natural, like best, making sure to have those right trace minerals. And the third one, which was getting into sodium bicarbonate, calcium bicarbonate, and potassium bicarbonate for using for pH up, and should we use a calcium bicarbonate earlier in veg, and as we go later in flower, maybe switch over to a potassium bicarbonate if we need to go pH up.
Brilliant.
And then get rid of the sodium bicarbonate because sodium adds up into the soil. So those were like 3 things that popped out. Like, please. Any one of those you want to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I did want to just make sure that I'm not an advocate of, and I know that a lot of the early interest in compost teas was to use them as foliars, and use that whole concept of the fact that if your plant if your plant leaf surface can be covered, your phyllosphere can be covered with beneficial microbes, then a pathogenic microbe won't be able to land on that leaf surface and survive, or it'll be outcompeted, and so on and so forth. When it really comes down to it, if you can produce an incredibly healthy plant, a healthy plant with a good waxy layer to it, a healthy plant that can actually have its own exudates. So plants have all of these endophytes, and if you have botrytis that lands on your plant, botrytis meaning bud rot and gray mold, your plant actually has some endophytes that are antibacterial or antifungals, and they can go and immediately be released from within the plant and fight off that botrytis or gray mold. So it's important, once again, optimal photosynthesis, and then the plant can do the rest if it's got a living soil system with it. When it comes to minerals, you really can't avoid getting a little bit of everything, right? So you do need your nitrogen, you need your phosphorus, your potassium, all those primary nutrients. When it comes to those secondary nutrients, definitely calcium and sulfur are two critical ones. Calcium, of course, because calcium is the transporter of the most of your nutrients, and so opening up calcium channels within the root membrane allows for a lot more nutrients to come into the plant. And when it comes to a lot of those microbes, it's all about those trace minerals, and for proper enzymatic reactions, you need the zinc, you need iron, you need selenium, you need copper. There's really no avoiding any one of these trace minerals. So it's really important to really have a good source of trace minerals. And if you, which of course, your trace minerals can come from things like, your rock dust, glacial rock dust, basalt rock dust, azomite, which essentially stands for the A to Z of minerals and trace elements, right? That's the acronym. And then things like kelp, kelp or dehydrated salt water, seawater. Those are great sources of trace minerals, and they'll have that zinc and the copper and the selenium and the cobalt, the nickel, these really small, sometimes we think micro is just being less important. No, they're micro because they need less of them, but they're equally important, and especially important in things like enzymatic reactions for bacteria, in terpene synthesis. One I've kind of neglected to mention is manganese. Manganese is so critical. We talk a lot about it right now in terms of SARS-CoV. So important for viruses that we have manganese in our system, because manganese is really important in terms of fighting off viruses.
I got a question about the microbiology, and you were talking about feeding the microbiology and the different microbiology taking over for the exudates, how they feed the exudates to the plants, right? And the BRIX levels in plants, because people said with the high BRIX levels, you can monitor it has a lot of sugar or carbohydrates or whatever in the plant. Does that mean it has a lot to feed the microbiology? So if you have high BRIX levels, then there's a lot of exudates available to feed that microbiology, so the plant can defend itself and build up that waxy layer better.
I think you nailed it right on the head. So
around BRIX, what's your thoughts around BRIX?
Yeah, so BRIX, for any of your viewers, I'm sure your viewers are quite knowledgeable about BRIX, but just in general, it's a concept came from a researcher in doing vineyard research in Switzerland, I believe, and created a refractometer, knowing that the sap of a plant when held up to a light, is going to refract light at different levels depending on the density of what's in that sap. And so we loosely call the sap as sugar, and we measure the sugar content, but it's essentially the total dissolved solids that is in that sap, which includes some vitamins and amino acids and so on. But for the most part, it's going to be a form of sugar. And there's been a theory, and I wholeheartedly believe in it, that certain insects and pathogens will not come to a healthy plant. So when, William Albrecht and folks like Phil Callahan and Kerry Reams, they really put the ideas out there that a healthy plant is not seen as a food source for pests and pathogens. And typically those plants, when healthy, have a higher BRIX level. And we loosely have just not randomly, but we specifically say, hey, if you can get around 12, 14 or higher in BRIX levels, then it's not seen as a food source. And it's not seen as a food source because it, in fact, is somewhat toxic to the insect metabolism, right? So,
right.
Oftentimes, when we feed a plant a lot of nitrate, nitrogen, we are watering down that plant. And I think we know it. We know that when we buy those strawberries, and I'll pick on California because we get a lot of California strawberries up here, and you bite into it, and the ones we get here are very watery, and then they don't have a lot of flavor, right? No different than your cannabis. If your cannabis has been fed a lot of nitrate, nitrogen, it might even be a little larfier. You don't have as much density in that bud, and you're not going to have that aroma. You're not going to have that taste that you can have when you have a higher BRIX level. You also will know that when you take a cannabis that has a lower BRIX, and it's not going to have the shelf life. It's going to turn more quickly into CBN, or it's just going to go off in its flavor much quicker. Whereas at higher BRIX, buds will maintain their flavor and aroma for at least a year. Sometimes, most of my cannabis is gone after about a year, but oftentimes it smells as almost as good as it went into that jar. Those are higher BRIX buds, and I think it's something that we want to continue to look as a little tool to say, are we doing the right things? And if we're not hitting those BRIX levels, what else is it that we can do to make sure that we're getting up to that level?
So you want to use it as a measuring tool, or how good we're doing, right? So me and Aaron have been having this conversation the last couple of days about the BRIX, and I'm working on spider mites because spider mites is a big problem for a lot of people. And once you got them, you have them, right?
Right.
So the other day we were talking privately that I caught on to another interview that we did with another guest, that he was saying the same thing you were saying, right? And that as your BRIX level was higher, your mites won't attack, or will be less susceptible to mites. So I'm saying maybe we're approaching this mite problem the wrong way. Maybe we should approach it a different way. By keeping our BRIX level really high, we'll be less susceptible to mites. We won't have to spray, won't have to deal with it.
I think there's a lot of information in the sap, and right now the science hasn't necessarily adopted sap analysis, especially in North America. In Europe, sap analysis is more common. You can send leaf tissue to many places, and they'll actually do a sap analysis for you. In that sap analysis, they'll often look into what's actually in that sap. And we can actually nail down which minerals are in there. I highly, if you're a little esoteric, a little metaphysical, I highly recommend reading Phil Callahan's Tuning into Nature. I believe Phil is still living. I think he's about 91, 92 years old and living, I believe, in California. So he'd be an amazing guest if he's still up to those things. But Tuning into Nature is just a phenomenal book. And it does highlight the idea that pests and pathogens are attracted to unhealthy plants. And we can have a plant that looks, in our eyes, looks like a relatively healthy plant, but it could be low BRIX. And it could be low BRIX because we've been feeding it a lot of extra nitrogen, and you will see that. So one of the goals that we have when we feed nitrate, and I pick on nitrate nitrogen, and I only mean it, it's great. You need nitrate nitrogen in early veg. That's really important to use nitrate nitrogen in veg, because it's going to promote that nice green growth, and we need that. After that, we could use more ammonia-based type nitrogens, something like a feather meal, something that's a little bit slower in releasing. Sometimes your alfalfa meals will have more of that ammonia-based nitrogen, whereas something like blood meal will have a lot of nitrate nitrogen, hen manure, nitrate nitrogen. We don't want to be feeding those late into veg, and definitely not into flower. We might want to use amino acids, because the goal in a root system is to take that nitrate nitrogen, and by the time it leaves the root system, it should be an amino acid, right? You want those nitrogen to be converted into peptides and turned into amino acids, and then hopefully turn those into proteins. When we think of spider mites, one of the main reasons we see spider mites, and I'm probably speaking, well, it could definitely happen outdoors, is when we hit really high temperatures. What happens in our plants is that they will start doing photorespiration. Typically, respiration happens in the darkness, but if you reach really high temperatures and you don't have a healthy enough plant that can reduce the stresses of high heat, you can actually get photorespiration, and that'll turn some of your nitrogen and your proteins back into ammonium, and or you may have high levels of nitrate. That's seen as a food source for spider mites. That's why you get spider mites. So it's a lot about controlling your nitrogen, making sure you don't have any nitrate nitrogen in your sap or any ammonia in your sap. All of it should be turned into proteins.
Just to ask a quick question, and to kind of bring this out actually into the surface, when we think about nature, that nitrate nitrogen is really only there for a few days after rainfall, and then it's converted over to ammonia nitrogen, right? Yeah. And so it's so if we're trying to mimic nature, that nitrate nitrogen, I mean, really, we, instead of mimicking how much rainfall is in our local area, we want to consider how much rainfall is in the areas that produce the highest quality herb. Yeah. Right. And so then maybe mimic that water cycle for the nitrates, and then think about it in that viewpoint versus how much nitrogen we should be giving based upon their recommendations. Do you?
And I go back to, Elaine Ingham again, when I first met her and had those conversations, and she was giving her presentations, she'd always talk about that maple tree, right? And it talked about that maple tree sending down a very syrupy sap in the spring. It was dedicated to trying to attract a particular type of bacteria that would produce a lot of nitrate nitrogen, right? So the plant was trying to say, hey, I need nitrate nitrogen. It's springtime. I have to produce a lot of green leaves. Let me get the right bacteria around my rhizosphere. All of a sudden, it says, hey, I don't need any more nitrate nitrogen. The sap also changed, right? It's no longer as sweet. It's definitely more starchy. It's feeding a whole bunch of different types of bacteria that are going to produce different things, whether it's more phosphorus or more potassium, or fungi that are going to be protecting the roots, or whatever. So as you said, Mark, and also, just to follow our whole idea, crop steering is becoming really popular within Canada. But crop steering is really mimicking what nature does in itself, right? In the springs, we get lots of water. We have certain types of nutrients. And then as the plant goes into summer and into fall, you get a little drought stress, you get a little colder temperatures. That's exactly what crop steering is. It's mimicking nature, and that's what we're trying to do with our nutrients as well.
Guys, go ahead and pick up. I completely forgot my thought around. Sorry about that.
Oh, I'm jumping back to your point. I thought about pH up and down, and I think that's brilliant in terms of using calcium carbonate as a source to pH up in veg, and then maybe a potassium base more in flower.
Can I explain this again? I'm not a scientist, but as I think about it, can I explain my thought process? Okay,
Yeah,
so
please do.
Okay, and also we're going back to the nitrogen we're talking about, and also going back actually over to multiple areas. So let's connecting that actually back over to adenosine triphosphate, when everyone's talking about sugars, exodites, but I don't think that their microbes are eating sugars. I think they're eating amino acids and peptides, really, and because I think adenosine is like the sugar, but when it's the triphosphate, it's the mineral, right? So it's no longer a sugar because it's changed. And so everyone's like, ATP, sugar, they're eating sugars and they're giving sugars to the teas, but I don't think that's right. I think they're just, but that's a whole nother point. So going back over to the pH up and down and kind of how it's connecting is use the nitrates or the urea, the plant stretches, it doesn't have the other trace minerals needed to create a strong cell walls, because the nitrogen is for the stem development, the leaves, not really for the green, but it's part for the green in a sense. And that's why we're having these thin walls and so on. And then, so we're talking about how can we fix that? And I hate to encourage synthetic growers but maybe calcium carbonate versus calcium sulfate, right? Because there's, to my understanding, less oxidation, I guess, happening with the calcium sulfate. So when you're using the calcium, so with the less oxidation, there's going to be a less pH change. And so using the calcium carbonate, which would release more CO2, would increase the which would increase the pH. And then because you're going from veg to flower and the plant stops growing, that's when I kind of encourage growers to back off on the calcium. It's like you said, it's holding on to the minerals and releasing that whole surface area cation exchange experience. But then also, I'm always finding a lot of growers dealing with the phosphorus deficiency as they go later into flowering. And a lot of people talk about how phosphorus and potassium are affected by the amount of calcium. So then I was thinking, okay, if people need to use a pH up or to balance the soil, switch over to a potassium carbonate, because that, again, and this is where I'm wondering is it's reacting with the hydrogen, I'm thinking, and it's releasing the CO2 and the potassium is being left behind, which then again increases the pH, but less calcium, less it's antagonizing. It's less antagonization on the potassium and the phosphorus, which should minimize and encourage the ATP production, because as they go into a harder condition, like hotter temperatures or colder environments as it's finishing off, we need more ATP production to help it versus hinder it.
Listening to you makes me feel sorry for people who have to listen to me, because I think we think very, very similarly and we talk similarly. So a big map would definitely help. I was going on a slight. Calcium carbonate is very oxidizing, right? It's very oxidizing. You're releasing so much more oxygen with calcium carbonate. Where I thought you were going is calcium, to me, is a great vegetative food, and we often have far too little calcium. We don't put enough emphasis on calcium. In my opinion, calcium is one of the most underrated minerals, and using enough calcium can really drive great vegetative growth. And at the same time, calcium is so valuable for root growth that it really maintains a good, healthy root system. And so I was thinking you were promoting calcium carbonate in veg, because calcium is so important in veg. And then I was thinking you were recommending potassium bicarbonate because potassium is so important in flower. And that's how I was keeping it.
That's how I was recommending too, for that reason. Exactly. But keep going how you interpret it, because I want to just dive into whatever you're interpreting it the way you are.
Well, it's the most important thing when we talk about minerals in general is the balance, right? And it's so hard to, and that's, to be honest, and I'm always transparent about this. The reason I like living soils is that, and especially just add water super soils, is that if you do an okay job of mixing an initial starting soil, the plant in the soil and the microbes are doing the rest of the work. And I don't have to try to play God and say, oh shit, I think I need a little bit of more magnesium, or I need a little bit more phosphorus, or I need this. The plant will dictate, say, listen, I need more phosphorus. I'm going to really push my mycorrhizae to deliver me some more phosphorus. Because that's where that ATP is, right? That's that. If I need energy, I need ATP. And so that's what the plant needs for energy. And the plant recognizes that the glucose that it's making, that is going to be good energy for those that don't know how to produce energy from the sun, right? So fungi can't, they can't photosynthesize. They need that sugar, they need that carbohydrate as their energy source. They care less about phosphorus. They can ship off that phosphorus for the plant that needs that phosphorus for its energy in ATP. And so, in my opinion, that's that whole exchange of sugar versus it's one form of energy being shifted for another form of energy for that whole plant.
Okay, so did we kind of encourage synthetic growers right there? Because that sucks if we did. We help out the organic growers by creating a more healthy environment for microbes to exist and flourish in different as the seasons are changing? Because it does get hotter week 4 on before it drops off in temperature normally. So there is more stressful conditions, what we're discussing. And so it would make sense, right? Because the plant is stopped growing, so we don't need as much calcium. And we do really need to buff up the ATP production. And that's why I'm always thinking also, is there a ratio of like a 3-to-1 or a ratio between phosphorus and potassium that you have identified a certain less or more or equal to make that really emphasize that last few weeks?
And there's always, there are these ratios, and definitely a P to K ratio is pretty critical, especially when it comes to sugar production. If you're imbalanced in terms of your P to K ratio, you will not hit those BRIX levels that you want. So if you have excessive phosphorus or excessive potassium or deficiency in either of them, you're not going to hit those ideal BRIX levels. And it's so critical to remember that in the cannabis space, based on some type of misinterpretation of some research data, we use way more phosphorus than we need to. So it's the only reason you have a phosphorus deficiency late in flower is perhaps because you have used too much calcium or you've got too much magnesium, because those are impacting the uptake of phosphorus, or your pH has risen too high or something like that. Those are the reasons you may run into a phosphorus deficiency in late flower. Because to be honest, phosphorus is really important at a bit of root development, and then whenever that plant needs that extra bit of energy, and typically needs extra energy right around transition. It's going from veg to flower. That's a really stressful time. It's got different growth. It's going to have that elongation as you flip into flower. It needs extra energy then. And it continues to need energy during that flowering period, but we add way too much phosphorus. And that's why, many hydroponic growers are forced to do that flush, because their root zone is so caked with extra phosphorus that if they don't, the plant will continue to take up that phosphorus, and you'll get that,
lower oil production.
So, yeah. So in my thought process, you really do want I don't think we're in any way encouraging hydroponic growing. In many ways, we're encouraging having balanced nutrient soils, and then letting the plant do a lot more of that work of deciding what we want to eat, when we want to eat it, and what form we want to eat it.
Can I interject real quick on the soil subject? And you mentioned you had I think it was stinging nettles planted. And I was curious because I've heard some studies saying that like a lot of companion planting with canopy plants, like stinging nettles planted next to a canopy plant, it will kind of build up a defense mechanism towards the stinging nettles, and it might produce more oils for
Really?
for trichome production and stuff.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that's I'd love to read more about that study. But along that same thread, now we're very careful. My wife doesn't allow me to leave our stinging nettle unwatched. So as soon as it hits flower, and typically, in the biodynamic world, when stinging nettle hits flower, it's the most powerful. So that's usually the time that I would harvest it for a biodynamic practice. But for my teas, I harvest it long before flower because I'm scared it will spread everywhere, and we don't want to get into trouble again.
What about the root zone? The roots from the other companion plants next to the canopy plants, how they interact with the microbiology, with the exudates from the other plants,
or using it in your tea, your tea.
Well, we wouldn't harvest our stinging nettle roots, but I like the way you're thinking, Aaron, and that's actually one of the reasons why we plant German chamomile. So German chamomile, we know that its roots will exude sterols, and sterols are a precursor to cannabinoids, and so we feel like we can increase our cannabinoid production because we've got some German chamomile. And then the other benefit of having German chamomile is that it's a small flower, and it's going to attract parasitic wasps. Those parasitic wasps, of course, can keep some of your predatory species away. So, like,
right.
How about marigolds and chili plants? How do those affect terpene production? Have you heard it or tested it around those two specific plants?
I know that like brassica plants. So some of those brassica will release brassica steroids. Those have been attributed to as biostimulants, and those biostimulants can increase secondary metabolite production. I'm not sure if the pepper roots or if it is exuding capsaicin, if that capsaicin is in fact a biostimulant. But along the same line, that's probably why people are using chitin. Whether it's a chitin that's coming from lobster shells or insect frass or something like that. But those chitins will stimulate the systemic acquired resistance of a plant or the induced systemic resistance. So you are triggering the salicylic acid pathway. And when you trigger that, you are getting increased secondary metabolite production.
So Perfect Garden's vision, 5 years, 10 years down the road, is cannabis farmers solving the world's ag problems. And the reason why I'm bringing up these plants is that I'm always kind of encouraging cannabis growers to put another type of plant in. So just encouraging them, if we put in one or two of these other types of plants, how far would these exudates be able to travel, or how much ratio? Let's say if we have a 20 by 20 lot of in there, normally let's say growers are growing 10 footers, and let's say they have 10 of them there. How many plants would you recommend planting every so often? Because I'm just trying to slowly urge them or nudge them over into the food direction. So what would you recommend to help them out, just in case type thing?
Yeah, I mean, the most important thing to remember, and I think, we're getting more and more people to understand this, is the importance that plants are not always competing against each other. They're, in fact, they're sharing their resources. And a Canadian researcher, Dr. Suzanne Simard, she's getting a lot of interest in the fact that she's talked about how different species are sharing resources. And so I think it's really important that we use companion planting for just even that resource sharing part. I also think it's really important to recognize that now that Canada has legalized and we have large scale grows, the world is blowing up. If we continue to grow in monocultures in essentially just a field of cannabis, we are inviting a whole new set of pathogens and a whole new set of pests that we won't be able to control with our current ways of controlling them. They're just going to become so rapid. So that's why we need the biodiversity. So we need the biodiversity because of the above ground is going to interact and challenge some of the pests and pathogens. And of course, we need it below ground because we might get those benefits of some of the exudates from different plants that are going to trigger an immune response in the cannabis plant, and or have the exudates that the cannabis plant can use to produce other secondary metabolites. So the main thing you don't want to do is you don't want to have something that's overly competitive and is to the point where it's competing against things like for light and for water. So if you have like white clover growing, and white clover is probably not the best because it can attract certain pests, but a low-lying crop, it's great to have that cover crop. And then I think of it more of having, if you use the permaculture concept of guilds, you might have your peppermint in a particular place, and some lemongrass in a particular place, and some chamomile, and some dill, and some coriander, some parsley, some lovage, borage, all of those type of plants growing hither and thither to attract beneficial insects. And that's going to be your best defense against things like and cornworm, things like that. Did I avoid the question about the density? No,
it's 100% perfect.
Yeah.
I want other growers out there to get out of the mind where it's just growing this plant and start to utilize their thought process into exploration in other plants. What we were talking about in the very beginning is and if they don't take all the wealth that's being accumulated in this opportunity now, when they're accumulating small amounts of land and start slowly transitioning, they're going to be, it's like at some point the market, I know it's blowing up, and I hope it converts over into fibers, into biodiesels, into concrete, into the 65,000 other products that are capable for. Highly recommend. 95% of the entire industry, the THC industry is only this minuscule 0.1, 0.3% of the industry, and then it's a little bit CBD, probably a little bit more, but then the majority is over here. So I'm always like, you did it perfect. I'm encouraging these other guys. I want them to just think slightly different next year before they plant. As they're creating their mindset of how to plant, where they should, till, whatever they should do. I just want to see these ideas into their mind before they do that, and maybe a few years down the road, they do, 4 acres of cannabis, 1 acre of food, and they get into other markets.
And if you can, definitely, do some interplanting, and the benefit of that interplanting is because it's important to know that parasitic wasps and some of these other beneficial insects, they're not going to travel an acre necessarily. They will find their food much closer. So if you can have them, interspersed amongst your cannabis plants, you get that opportunity to have essentially your mobile like a hospital right there for each plant. With all these beneficial insects around them. And, I don't know how metaphysical you get, but I do find that the cannabis plant is this, a higher level of intelligence than a lot of the other plants that I've worked with. I think they're like an older plant. They're a wiser plant. I think they enjoy communicating with other plants. And so I think it's a disservice if we end up having, just rows of cannabis plants in bare soil. So important for them to be able to communicate to other plants and socialize and whatever else plants do that we have no idea that they do.
I completely agree. Guys, do you guys have any more questions?
I do. I got a question about the Autoflowers. It kind of goes along with the BRIX too, because Autoflowers, Jeff Lowenfels. I've been following him, the guy that did teaming with microbes and stuff. He's real big on this autoflower revolution. He got me going on the autoflower revolution. And one of the things that he said that really got to me that I thought was beneficial was that the autoflowers plant life, it moves so fast that the insects don't recognize it. So they become insect, kind of resistant to insects because they grow so fast in their lifestyle. What's your thoughts behind that theory?
Wow. Jeff does have some interesting theories. That's a good one. I'm a little lost on that theory because I've grown some autoflowers that just didn't look the healthiest and have become prone to, usually my problem is that I'm growing an autoflower in a just add water super soil, and I haven't diluted the nutrient content of that super soil. And so the root growth is just stagnated because it's not an appropriate mineral balanced soil for an autoflower, right? I need a weaker nutrient soil. I need a less nutrient dense soil for my autos.
Right. They always say nothing. They say not to use anything. Really, a lot of them say don't. They should just start off plain with nothing in them at all. I mean, if you're not gonna, don't treat them like photos for sure. But I was just curious.
Or less water soluble, or less water solubility content as you're building your super soil initially, right?
Yeah, definitely. Cut back your if you have a nutrient dense super soil, definitely cut it back to the point where Aaron, I think some of the newer, because a lot of the autoflowers now have more than just ruderalis in it. And so I feel like they do require a little bit more feed than just, trying to grow it in a Sunshine No. 4 Pro Mix type soil. You need a little bit more, nutrient density there. But
no, I agree. I use the flower with mine. I go straight like the 484. I use like the Down to Earth or like the Gaia Green 484, right. And I just mix that into the soil so it has those nutrients available. But I do like a plain plug where it grows into nothing, and then it gets the 484 when it reaches out, and then some top dressings along the way. But the autoflowers, he also mentioned, so I stay in line with what he said, was it had to do with the right genetics. And he said like Mephisto genetics, and he was plugging Mephisto genetics and new breed seed out of Oregon. And, those were the newer genetics like you were talking about. He did talk about like the lowrider that came out originally that was no THC basically in it. It was ruderalis. It was found in rubble in Russia, a long time ago. And it wasn't until they mixed it with the other plants it became beneficial to us and becoming autoflowers, right? Yeah. So I was just curious what your thoughts were behind that.
Evolutionarily, if you follow Jeff's work and how he talks a lot about plant succession, a ruderalis would behave more like a brassica in many ways. Like it's probably prefers a more bacterial dominant soil, something that doesn't need may not need more of a fungal dominant soil like a sativa or indica species, just because of the way it grows in terms of its short life cycle. Like, typically when we think of ruderalis, we're thinking of this grows really fast, 70 days, it's done. That's a really short life cycle in plants. So maybe there are some next time I'm gonna quiz him on his thought process there.
Yeah, no, it was interesting.
Yeah.
Any other questions, you guys?
Can I shift the topic to water? It seems like water is always an issue throughout the community, and the source primarily where people have tap water or RO water or well water, and I just transitioned into RO water, a 2-to-1 system and it's putting out 0 ppm and coming in at a pH about 7.8 to 8.0. And my question is, in my mind, I need to add something back into it to stabilize it, to properly stabilize the water to get my pH where I want it to before I add it to my soil. And I guess my question would be, can you add pure RO water into an organic living soil, or can it potentially strip minerals or hold on to it since it's so hungry or it has nothing in it to where even when you stir it, it goes extremely acidic?
So it'll go
alkaline,
extremely acidic.
Alkaline.
If I stir my RO water, it starts at 7.8. I can stir it. If I stir for 2 minutes, it'll go down to 4.8, 5.4.
And then if you let it settle back, will it rise again?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, yeah, definitely. Dissolved oxygen is always important to maintain a high level of dissolved oxygen. So you want to make sure that it's at least, I like 10 parts per million. So if you can do that, it's always nice to know what's in your RO water that's causing the high pH. If it's leftover calcium or magnesium in that, or potassium, that way if you're running into any of these deficiencies, or you'll know what to top up. Because if you add a 7-8 water consistently in a living soil bed, you may not see any deficiencies. Living soil beds and living soil typically has incredible buffering capacity. And you could add things like a humic acid as well to increase the buffering capacity of your water. But if you continue to use that, you might start seeing things like a zinc deficiency or an iron deficiency, iron chlorosis, or perhaps even a phosphorus deficiency, because you're rising your pH up, beyond something that the organic matter can counteract.
Right.
Was there a reason why you couldn't just use your well water or tap water?
I personally, I have city water.
Yeah.
And the main reason is just the additives, the chlorine, chloramine, fluoride, and stuff like that. And originally, I had a hard time stabilizing that pH. So originally, and we did a little experiments in house here at Perfect Gardens, because I could, pH my city water to 6.5, and the very next day it'd be back alkaline at 8.0. Mm-hmm. And then I could pH it again. And I'm just trying to create where if I want to consistently get a 6.5, 6.6, 6.7, that I have that. So I just got the RO system, and I find that I can stabilize it if I add a little bit something into it. So I kind of been doing further experiments where I added like 75% RO water, 25% like spring water, and maybe with a little bit of calcium, and a little bit of magnesium, and drops of balance, and all of a sudden, boom, it holds at 6.7, and where it won't fluctuate. So that's why my mindset was, this water is starving for something. I literally stripped it of everything, but at the same time, it's it wants something, and it can take it super quick. And by me stirring it and taking it, what I would think, the CO2 out of the air is what makes it drive down the pH. That if I introduce minerals back into it, it'd be more stable.
Just tell me if so when you're stirring it, and I had a small aha moment. Tell me if I'm correct on this. When you're stirring it, it's creating a high oxidation experience, so it's dropping the pH, and then when it settles, it's sucking the CO2 out of the air, creating an alkaline experience. And that's making me wonder, because the RO is so sensitive, the water is so stripped, it is so sensitive. We're seeing it right there. It's like you oxidize it, drops the pH. You don't, and it settles. It sucks the CO2 back out of the environment. Am I thinking that correct?
And I'm gonna have to defer to that, or perhaps your viewers. I've got limited knowledge on exactly where, because our water and how it acidifies and becomes alkaline, not one of my strong points.
Oh, you Canadians out there with your great
Dang it.
water. I'm tired of hearing
know.
that crap. Man.
Well, he's a soil biologist, not a water biologist.
No, it's and it is
Soil
true.
guy, not a water guy.
I and I go back to the idea of a living soil. Living soils just make so much things easier because they've got that buffering capacity and so on and so forth. But I know you can run into problems of getting extremely high pH, especially if you're using amendments like coco coir and it's not properly charged, or you can run high pHs. And Dave, it's important that you express things like the fact that I wouldn't worry as much about the fluoride or chlorine, because that can definitely volatilize and gas off in about 12 hours or 24 hours. So if you have a good water reservoir, that'll happen. But chloramines, you really actually have to boil those to rid a water of chloramine. So,
to it, and I know that with soil, and I've seen it because throughout my last grow, measuring the pH of the soil, I can consistently water at 6.5, 6.5, 6.5. And then at certain points, that pH in the soil is 6.8. And then at other points, it might be at 6.4. So in my mind, I'm like, okay, there's got to be good biology in this soil right now. And the biology is communicating and they're doing what they need to do. And adjust it by adding certain amendments or higher pH water to get it back up, but just trusting that the microbial life in that soil is doing its part. And I've seen these fluctuations all the time, these minor fluctuations. And when we just let it happen, it seems that we don't play chemist at that point. They thrive.
And I think this really increases the power of observation as a grower. If you go out in your garden every day and you're looking for those, hey, am I starting to see some calcium deficiencies, or am I, the characteristic rust spots in those lower leaves or mid leaves, or am I seeing a magnesium deficiency of that interveinal chlorosis? That's so critical, because when we try to use instrumentation to really try to understand that soil ecosystem, we're invariably we're going to be wrong, because the pH changes within centimeters, millimeters of the root atmosphere. The rhizosphere microbes can create a pH of 6.0 when they want to fix nitrogen, for example, or something like that. They'll create an anaerobic environment to fix nitrogen. All of these things can happen, and then less than a millimeter away, you could have a pH of 6.2.
Right, and I think that's a super important thing for the people that are listening, because I think so often, at least what I see throughout the cannabis, home growing community, is that they feel like if they water in at 6.5, the runoff should be 6.5. Their plants are perfectly healthy, but they feel to add something like, I need to add dolomite lime, I need to add this. And it just complicates I think the system that much more, to where if you can establish a good, healthy soil, a good microbial life, it balances, it shows that it does all the work for you.
Yeah, I think going back to Mark's comments, that says it all. We're here to mimic nature. And, it all starts by observing nature and what nature's doing. And I think that's your perfect gardens.
Perfect.
That's great. We look forward to doing that with you too.
Yeah. I'm very excited. Great. Thanks for having me.
Where can they find you? Have you guys covered that already?
No, we did not.
I want to make sure to post that. I'm going to put that in the description, but where can they find you? Where if people are looking for you for business or licensing or other things, what's the best way of contacting you?
Unfortunately, it's going to be Av at fs-cannabis.com. The email that you've been sending my stuff to.
Okay. Yeah. I'll make sure to put it on the top of this video so it's available all the way through. So they'll have it to contact you all the way through.
Perfect. Oh, halfway when you were speaking, Mark, I just said, oh, that's how I must sound. I was just flowing. I was following your train of thought.
I think whenever I talk, I am always imagining I'm on that sitcom where it's like wah, 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 wah,
it wasn't that. It's a holistic answer, and so it's going to be, it's everything.
It's circular. Right? It's connected. It is. I agree.
Yeah. I enjoyed it. I got this, grin on my face. I enjoyed just the whole idea. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Hey, Mike, just want to say thank you, brother, so much for pushing this meeting, man, and just making the connection, because this was like a 2-year connection or something with Mike. It just, and then we got on the phone within a week or two. So thank you for helping save all this time.
I love the imagery of Canadian bacon.
That's all Dave.
Yeah, Dave made the artwork.
Oh, beautiful, Dave. Great job.
Thank you.
Cheers, everyone.
Cheers
guys.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Have a great day. Only on Perfect Gardens TV.
Of course, bakuano is derived from the feces of bats in these caves. And as the bats go out at night, they're massively feeding on millions and millions of insects and coming back in and doing their business.